You've got a bench grinder, right? No, I understand. You're an 18th century hand tool only woodworker, or you're a Greenwood Windsor chair maker, or you're a period correct blacksmith, and you never let anything with a power cord even come into your shop. I completely understand. But you need one of these anyway. So go get one and meet me back here. You've got about 7 seconds. That should be plenty of time. In my last video, I explained how you can buy good hand planes for cheap. But if you're buying a plane for $5, it's not going to be ready to go. It's going to need restoration. Now, there are already a lot of good videos on YouTube for how you can restore a plane using hand tools like sandpaper, steel wool, stuff like that. There's no reason for me to remake one of those videos, so I'll just link to a couple of the good ones down in the description. Now, myself, I've restored dozens of hand planes over the years, and I've gotten pretty quick at it, mostly because of this thing right here. Just to prove the point, let's look at what happens to a craftsman who's working on a plane but doesn't have a bench grinder.
So first off, let's go through building the iron. I started with 1/4 inch 01 steel by 1/2 inch and cut it down to about 6 inches. In order to make the tip on the iron, I used a red Sharpie to mark out what I needed to remove, and that way I could get back to it. This is a piece of sandpaper 2 foot wide by 20 foot, and I got it at a resale shop for $1. Amazing find. But for this, it actually makes fairly quick work. It was only about 20 minutes of this in order to get the angle down to what I wanted.
Dude, you have got to be f***ing kidding me. So here's how you can set up your bench grinder to make your shop work much quicker and easier. This is a standard 6-inch high-speed bench grinder. You can find them pretty much anywhere. Now when you first get it, it's going to come set up with a coarse grinding wheel and a fine grinding wheel. The most important thing for you to do is take the fine grinding wheel and throw it away. It's not good for anything, especially because it heats up metal much too quickly, and it causes you to lose temper on hardened steel. Once you get rid of the fine wheel that's usually on this side, replace it with either a medium or a fine wire wheel. You can use that for polishing metal, removing rust, all sorts of cleaning tasks. The coarse wheel will do all of the rough shaping, sharpening, and deburring that you could need, and the wire wheel is going to take care of everything else. Once you have it set up this way, you'll probably never need to change it. Now that we've got our grinder set up, let's use it to restore this plane. This thing's really typical of what I would usually find at a flea market or an antique mall. I knew it was a good plane to buy because it's in generally good shape. The iron is very long, sticks up way past the cap iron, past the lever cap. That means there's plenty of edge left, and I'll be able to sharpen it for years without replacing it. Also, the wood is in good shape. The rear handle, which is called the tote, doesn't have any significant cracks or splits, and all the wood is there. The front handle, which is called the knob, is also in good shape, although those usually are. Now, the plane itself is in good condition overall. I don't see any cracks or splits anywhere in the sides here. These are called the cheeks. If there's anything cracked or broken here, walk away from the plane unless it's extremely cheap and you want it for parts. Those cracks are very, very difficult to repair. I also want to check carefully all along the sole here and make sure that if there's any rust, it's not deep. You don't want much pitting, although a little bit is okay. The mouth is also very important. There shouldn't be any significant cracks in the corners, and you don't want any chipping along these edges. They need to be in good shape. Now, all of those things are fine, but overall, this plane is in rough shape. You can see it's very rusty. A lot of the parts look seized up. The lever cap is completely corroded. The wood finish is very poor. There are nicks and dings that need to be fixed and sorted out, and everything about it is dull and unused looking. If I had to guess, I would say this plane probably hasn't touched a piece of wood in 30 or 40 years minimum, and it's going to take a little bit of work to get it up and running again. But the mighty bench grinder is going to come to the rescue, and using this fantastic tool, which if you can't tell I'm a big fan of, we're going to be able to get this plane up and running probably in about an hour. If I have time beforehand, I break out a can of 3-in-1 oil and lubricate everything on the plane at least a few hours before I work on it. I start by doing the pivot on the lever cap, which helps to get it off. Then I take the blade and chip breaker assembly and lubricate both sides of the screw that holds them together. These are often frozen in place and the oil needs time to soak in. After that's done, I make sure to do the pivot for the lateral adjuster, move it back and forth a few times to get the oil worked in. Then I do the lever cap screw, and I reach down and lubricate the 2 screws that hold the frog to the bed. These are often seized up, and lubricating them ahead of time is going to help them come out. When that's done, I flip the plane around and lubricate both ends of the shaft that the depth adjustment wheel is sitting on. These are also often seized, and they can be damaged if you roll them over a lot of grit. The oil helps clean the shaft off and gets the knob to move freely. This last part's a little tough to shoot, but I also want to make sure to get a lot of oil in the frog adjustment screw and the screw that holds the frog adjustment yoke to the frog itself. People don't adjust these very often. They usually haven't been moved in years, so they need a lot of lubrication. Now, you see screw heads on the top of the knob and the tote, but don't lubricate those. Those connect to shafts that thread into the bottom of the plane bed, and you're not going to get the oil down there. Putting oil on the top of those screws is only going to degrade the wood. It's not going to help anything. I always do this at least a few hours before I start the restoration, but it's even better if you can do it the day before and let the oil soak in overnight. If you've oiled it beforehand, disassembling the plane is very straightforward. All the screws are straight blade, so all you need is a medium straight blade screwdriver. You can start anywhere you want, but I usually go with the knob and the tote. You don't get a chance to lubricate them, but in general, I find they come right off. While I'm working, I take all the small parts and put them in a little container where I can't lose them. After I've got the knob off, I move on to the lever cap screw. Then I want to pull apart the iron and the chip breaker. I lubricated these ahead of time so the screw comes out easily. And I can set those aside. And the next thing I want to do is get the frog assembly off of the plane. The frog adjustment screws tend to be sticky, but again, I lubricated them ahead of time so they're coming out pretty easily. Now as you take these out, pay attention to the fact that both of these screws have a little washer. Don't lose those washers. You're going to need them. As soon as I get the frog out, I look for the inevitable crap that's underneath. In this case, it's shavings, probably from the Nixon administration, that are still stuck in this plane. And get rid of those because they'll just hold oil and make a mess. Then I turn the plane around, find the frog adjustment screw, and back that all the way out. The tote should come off as easily as the knob did, although since we can't lubricate it, it takes a bit of elbow grease to get those threads to free up. Check over the tote, make sure it doesn't have any problems or cracks I couldn't see, but no, it's in good shape. Now the plane body itself is totally stripped down and ready for restoration. I'm lucky on this one because almost all of the Japanning, which is what you call this black paint here, it's all intact. That means I'm not going to be tempted to touch anything up. Although honestly, I don't touch anything up even when it's missing. The last thing I want to do is disassemble the frog. This is the adjustment wheel right here. The yoke, which is this little floppy piece right here, and the lateral adjustment lever don't come off, so don't bother trying. The last thing you need to worry about is the frog adjustment yoke, which is this little piece of steel that sticks down and engages with the frog adjustment screw. That needs to come off too, and they're usually quite frozen. This one popped out, although it took a second. So, now I've got the blade assembly, the lever cap, the wood, the frog, and the body of the plane itself. And all of these things can go straight to the bench grinder for restoration.
So I'm starting up the wire wheel, but before I do anything, I put on my safety glasses. These wheels move at 4,500 RPMs, and the bristles fly off a lot of the time. Catch one of those in the eye, and it'll definitely ruin your day. If you haven't used a wire wheel before, it's easy. Keep the piece that you're working on at or below the center line of the wheel, and use steady, even pressure. I just did a couple of quick strokes there, and you can see how much rust I took off. I finish up the rest of it, and then look to the sole. It's not badly rusted, but there is corrosion there. Once I polish it up on the wire wheel, it's nice and shiny. Now I'm going to move on to the blade. You can see that it's got a lot of flaky rust. The corrosion here is serious. I start by working the leading edge, but while I'm working on it, I notice the edge of the blade is still really sharp. I'm going to tape that up really quickly so that the wheel can't drive it into my hand while I'm working. Now I can start working on the flats of the blade, moving around, using two hands, keeping gentle pressure, and being really careful not to let the wheel grab one of the edges and pull the blade out of my hand. It only takes a few minutes before I've got it bright and shiny. This is done, and I can set it aside. When I'm working on the frog, it's really important this face be clean. That flaky rust down at the bottom, that's where the edge of the blade meets the frog. It needs to be well supported, and that rust is going to make a poor fit. So I'm going to make sure to clean that carefully. I also do the lateral lever just for comfort. Down here at the bottom, these are the places where the frog meets the bed. They can't be rusty either, so I give them a couple strokes on the wheel to get them clean and bright. Now the frog's done, and I can move on to the chip ring. It's not bad, but there are a few spots there that I can quickly take off with the wheel. This part's done, and I can move on. The lever cap is so corroded that the nickel plating on it's turned green, and most of it's fallen off. The wire wheel actually pulls all the rest of the plating off, but it wasn't recoverable anyway, and now the lever cap's shiny. Now I'm moving on to these small pieces. Most of us would put these in a jar of vinegar or of apple rust and let them sit overnight, but you can do it a lot faster with the wire wheel. Just grab them with a pair of pliers or channel locks and set them against the wheel. You can rotate them as you're working to expose new areas and get all the rust off. You can also grab them on the edges and put the flat against the wheel too. This is a little bit trickier to do because the wheel wants to grab them, but you'll get the hang of it pretty quickly. Now it's only taken me a little bit of work, and this part is done. I can move on. When you use screws on the wire wheel, you want to grab them with the pliers by the head. Put the threads parallel to the wheel and rotate them slowly. The individual bristles of the wire wheel are really good for whipping all of the junk and rust out from in between the threads. Then you can flip it around, grab it by the threads, and take care of the head. That screw's literally as good as new. I won't need to do anything to it, probably ever again. You can do the same thing with a washer. Turn it around whichever way you need to keep the flat side against the wire wheel. Again, keep the edges carefully away. Now I'm moving on to the screw that holds the iron and the chip ring together. This is too small to hold with the pliers comfortably, but I can actually just do it with my hands. After I've got the head done, I turn it around and use the edge of the wire wheel to get into the short threaded part of the screw. It seems dangerous to get this close to the wheel, but it's really not. If you brush your skin for a second, it hurts and takes off a little bit, but it's not going to give you any kind of serious injury. The screw that holds on the lever cap is hard to hold on to because it's kind of round. So I grab it in both hands and just slowly rotate it through the bristles. Then I grab the shaft and work the head. Now a nice part like this, nice fine piece of brass, I should use that with brass polish or something. Now, I'm actually just going to go straight to the wheel. It cleans up nicely. Now the inside is still really dirty, and I can't get at that with the wheel. So I have this tiny wheel that I got for $1, and it just goes into my cordless drill. I work that for just a minute, and then go at it with a paper towel. Now I have a nice, bright, shiny piece of brass.
Now that we have the parts de-rusted, there's a few other things we can do with the grinder, specifically the grinding wheel, that's going to make the process go a lot faster. One thing I want to point out is that a lot of older planes, like this one, have a really loose rear tote. And you'll find the plane and you'll think, oh, I can just tighten up that screw and it'll be fine. But you'll stick a screwdriver in there and find that it's already as tight as it can go, and the tote is still loose. What happens there is these old rosewood totes compress as they get older and they dry out, and you run out of adjustment in that long metal shaft that tightens them down. That's actually not a problem if you've got a bench grinder. You take that long metal shaft right here, go over to your coarse grinding wheel, and just kiss the wheel with it a couple of times until you've taken off maybe a 32nd of an inch or a little bit more. Then reinstall it in your plane and you'll have enough travel to get that rear tote socked down again. Now that only happens some of the time. A lot more often what we're doing is using the grinder to reestablish a good bevel on the iron. Now, this iron isn't in bad shape, it's pretty good. I feel like I could probably even hone it the way it is. But I'm going to use the grinder anyway, because since I do freehand honing, it's very useful to start off with a perfect bevel to begin with. The most important thing about your grinder when you go to grind your bevel is that you have a good tool rest. Now, this is a relatively expensive grinder, so it actually came with a good one built in. It's adjustable in several ways, and it's actually very solid. A lot of cheaper grinders come with really bad ones that aren't useful. And if you buy your grinder used, it's very likely not going to come with them at all. Luckily, there are plans all over the internet for building accurate and inexpensive ones out of wood. You can just do a quick search and find one of those. They're easy to build. If you do have one of these, I need to point out one feature that can get in the way sometimes. I think the manufacturers were trying to make these more reliable and more robust. And what they did is they built in, on the pivot point here, a series of teeth like a gear. And you can see there's a matching set of teeth in here as well. And that means that when you tighten the thing down, those gears mesh with one another and lock it in place really strongly. The problem is, there aren't that many gears, and it limits the number of possible positions that you can get out of it. And very often, the exact angle that you want to get, which is frequently pretty precise, you can't get it because the gears won't lock in the exact position you're looking for. Luckily, that's a really easy thing to modify. You just take the platform like this, you find a washer that fits in there, and you drop it in. Then, you can reinstall the platform, and when you're done, it still locks down just as well as before, but now you have totally smooth adjustment, and you can get any angle that you need. Now, getting that bevel to be the correct angle can be kind of tricky. I go with 25 degrees, but it's tough to figure out if this is actually positioned at 25 or not. So you just make a little template like this. It's just a square piece of cardstock with a little 25-degree angle cut in it. You put it against your platform, and then you adjust the platform up until that 25-degree angle is hitting the wheel where you expect the blade to hit the wheel. And you can check it pretty easily by putting the blade up against it and seeing if it looks good. Now I'll turn on the grinder and grind the bevel.
A lot of people seem intimidated by power grinding plane irons and chisels. A lot of people also spend a lot of money on expensive, slow-speed, water-cooled grinders. But I don't think there's any reason for that. The biggest danger in a process like this is that you might turn a little piece of the blade blue. That means you've drawn the temper or taken out the hardness, but that's not a catastrophe. Keep a little cup of water next to you while you're grinding and dunk the blade in now and then. If you do get a little piece blue, then just dunk it straight in the water and the temper will probably come right back. Any part that is discolored through grinding can just be ground back a little bit further and you'll get to fresh steel again. It's very, very difficult to ruin the blade, and you probably won't. Now, while you're grinding, you might want to notice that I keep my fingers on the bottom part of the platform there and slide those back and forth. Keeping my fingers there keeps the blade straight and exactly parallel to the surface of the grinding wheel. By doing that, I've got a nice, even bevel and it's straight across.
So this is my sharpening rig. It's nothing special. It's just some oil stones and a common strop. Before I can assemble the blade, I need to hone the edge, and even more importantly, flatten the back. This is a stage that a lot of people probably neglect or don't think too much about, but the back of the blade is actually what does the cutting. Take your coarsest stone, put the blade flat against it, and work it back and forth. After you've done that for a little while, you can look at the pattern of scratches that are left afterwards. Looking at this one, it's actually in pretty decent shape. The blade is fairly flat. I see a little bit of a hollow spot in here, so I'm going to keep working on the back a bit. I also see some parts on the edges, like right there, that aren't nice and shiny. That tells me they haven't contacted the stone, and so they're not flat either. On the whole, though, this is an unusually flat iron. Now I've got a nice shiny scratch pattern that goes all the way along that front half edge of the blade. That's fine for now because it's going to take me years to sharpen past the first half edge of this iron. So even though there's some hollowing in other parts, I'm not going to worry about it. I'm going to get on to honing the bevel. I freehand sharpen, and that's a fairly boring process to watch, and there's lots of people who've already bloviated about it on YouTube, so why don't I just get on with it very quickly. Yeah, sharp enough for me. The last piece of metal work I have to do is prepare the cap iron, which is this blade-shaped looking piece of metal right here that sits on top of the actual iron and kind of makes a sandwich. Now, if there isn't a good mating surface between this front edge of the cap iron and the back of the iron itself, then you're going to get chips jammed up in between and the plane's going to stop working. It's easy to check if you have a good mating surface. You put the two of them together like this and hold them up to the light. You shouldn't be able to see any light in between the two of them. Now I can see a little bit of light, and that means this thing needs work. I'm just going to go over to the same stones I just used. I'm going to put the cap iron down on my coarse stone. I'm going to let it down a little bit so that I'm going to create a sloped edge and work it back and forth on the stone. After a couple of passes, I can just look with what I've done, and I should see a nice bright silvery line here, which I do. That means I've taken metal off of everything. Then I'll go on to my other stones. I just use the ends because I can't really get to the edges the way I have them set up, but that's fine. And I slowly refine that edge until it's a lot smoother. Now doing this raises a bit of a burr, a bit of a wire edge on the front here, and we really want this front section to be as polished as possible so when the shavings come curling up over it, they encounter as little resistance as they can. I put that curved part down on the stone and I swipe towards myself like this, picking up on the end of my stroke so that I'm creating a very rounded and polished surface here. Now I'll do that on all the rest of them. Now I've got an excellent, polished, smooth surface here, but I've also created another burr, a really bad one on this side, that's going to completely screw up its ability to mate with the iron. So now it's back to the stones again. Now the best thing here is to use the strop, which I have charged with some fine compound. I'm using that same curling motion to polish the top, and then I'll flip it over and just rake down the strop to polish the underside. Then when I feel along it, I feel a smooth and kind of sharp knife-like edge. Now, put those together, and getting in a position where I can see against a nice bright light, I'll hold them up again And now I don't see any light coming through between them. That means I've done a good job of mating them up, and they're ready to go back in the plane. I'm over at my drill press because I want to talk about the two wooden parts of the plane, the knob and the tote. Now, as I talked about before, the ones on this plane aren't particularly bad. They're pretty smooth and the varnish is mostly intact. The tote is a little bit beat up, but honestly, it's not bad enough for me to do anything about. However, on a lot of planes you buy for cheap, these are going to be in really bad shape and you're going to need to restore them. Now, it's pretty straightforward. I usually sand them with a couple of different grits of sandpaper, and then I like to apply a coat of boiled linseed oil, let that dry overnight, and then top coat it with either polyurethane or shellac. You can skip the boiled linseed oil if you want to. It really doesn't make a lot of difference. This piece, the tote, is usually pretty easy to work on. You just sand it down. But the knob, because of how round it is, it's very difficult to sand, and when you do, you often get lines or flat spots from where you try to work around it. So it's really tricky to get a good result on this one. The drill press can be really helpful. Here's a trick I figured out. Take the tote, the big handle and back, and pop out the stem that holds it onto the plane. It's got this nice brass nut on the end. Take this long stem and put it through the knob so that it sticks out the bottom, like this. And take that and put it right up into your drill press. Tighten it by hand, and then bring in the chuck key and make sure it's nice and solid. Once it's in there, you can turn on the drill press and then just hold a piece of sandpaper up against it, like this. It's going to wobble a little bit because this isn't a perfect arrangement, but it holds it securely enough that you can press in with the sandpaper and you work your way into all the different nooks and crannies. Because it's spinning, you're going to end up doing a good sanding job with no flat spots and no lines. You can progress down through finer and finer grits, finish up with a piece of steel wool if you want to, and then it'll be ready for finishing. Now, you might not have a drill press, that's totally fine. Feel free to grab your cordless drill and do the same trick. Just hold the drill in one hand and the sandpaper in the other. Okay, so I've only been working on this plane for about an hour, but it's already ready to reassemble. I'll start by taking my 3-in-1 oil and putting a little drop in each of the holes on the base casting. And as I continue through, any place I find a hole anywhere like the frog or the inside of a piece of hardware, like the depth adjusting wheel, I'll put a drop of oil in that too. Do it now and you won't have to do it again for a long time. Reassembly is very straightforward. Just think about what you did when you took the plane apart and do the opposite of that.
When I'm reassembling a plane, I start with the frog. I put on the frog adjustment fork and screw it in. Then I flip it over, hold up the adjustment yoke, and slide on the brass adjustment wheel so that it fits in. I lubricate the screw that holds on the lever cap, and I'm done. Put on the plane body, put the frog on top of it, and use a straight edge to make sure the 45-degree angle of the frog mates up with the 45-degree angle at the rear of the mount. Then I can tighten the screws. After that, I move on to the knob, then get the chip breaker and the blade and assemble them. But I did that backwards, so I'm doing it again. Once they're together and tightened up, I put them in the plane. Next, I move on to the tote. I have to take the blade out and move the lateral adjustment to the side to access the screw, but then the blade can go back in. I adjust the lever cap screw and tighten down the lever cap. I'm done.
So, my plane is sharp, got a test piece in the vise, I'm ready to make some shavings, right? Not so fast. I've actually left out a crucial step. We haven't done anything to make sure that the bottom of this plane is flat, and that needs to happen. In the old-fashioned by hand method of plane restoration, we'd probably spend a long time grinding this thing back and forth on a piece of sandpaper that we've glued to a piece of glass or something else flat. We don't have to do that because we've got the bench grinder. We're just going to take the plane and then we're going to hold it up to the honestly, I've never come up with anything that I can do with a grinder to flatten the sole of a plane. I just do it the same way everybody else does. I start out with this piece of glass. It's about 1/2 inch thick and very flat. I found it in a dumpster, so the price was right. I put a piece of 180 grit garnet paper on top. I find that works the best, but you can use whatever you have laying around. I like to stick it to the glass with Super 77 spray-on adhesive. I'll do that off camera. Spray the adhesive directly on the back of your paper, and then put the paper on the glass. When you do, make sure you line up one edge of the paper very exactly with the edge of the glass. Even better is if you use 2 edges. I'll show you why in a minute. Now we have a nice flat surface with a good abrasive on top. I take a piece of drawer liner from a cabinet and put it under my piece of glass so it doesn't move around on me. I also orient the glass the long way because that's the way it's most comfortable to work. Now, you need to do this with the plane fully assembled. The body of the plane needs to be under tension from all these internal components for it to be in the actual position it'll be in when you're using it. If you lap the body without all the rest of the stuff attached, it's not going to come out flat. So even though it would have been convenient to do this earlier, you usually end up saving it until the end. You don't want to mess up your freshly sharpened blade, so make sure that's retracted as far back in the body as it can be. Now, put the plane on the piece of paper, hold it loosely like this, put gentle pressure on it evenly, and move it back and forth a few times. Right away you can see the paper's turning gray. Cast iron is soft and it's easy to work with abrasives. After you've taken a few strokes, you have your real moment of truth. Looking at this plane, I can actually see that we're really lucky. It's almost flat just the way it is. There's only a few parts that need more work. Along the toe, right here is still a bit low, and there are some hollow spots in here and on the edges. What's really important is the area right in front of the mouth, the majority of the toe, and the heel. These are the contact points that make sure it actually registers correctly against the wood. These are already flat, which is great news. I've spent hours on these before, but I'm actually going to get this one done in just a couple of minutes. Hold on. If the paper gets loaded up with dust like this, it'll start to feel smooth, like it's not cutting anymore. Don't change the paper right away. Just take a brush or some compressed air and get rid of that dust. You should also put on a mask at this point because cast iron dust is not something you want to breathe. Now as we look at the plane again, we can see that the sole is in excellent condition. The toe is almost completely lapped. There's a very small bit area here where it's not making contact, but I'm not going to worry about that. You can also see there's still a bit of a hollow here, but I'm going to ignore that completely because the plane is going to register against the wood here and at the heel. This part really doesn't matter. I don't ever need to fix it. And I'm kind of lazy, so I'm not going to. Now, as long as we've got the plane here and the adhesive paper, there's one more step we can do that really helps us to tune the plane. The last thing we're going to do is lap and true up the face of the frog. Since this is the part that the blade actually makes contact against during work, it's best if this can be as flat and smooth as possible. Stanley machined these with a mill, so there are a lot of milling marks on it. There's also been a lot of time for rust to happen. All the rust that we saw before on this, that we took off with the wire wheel, that left a bubbled and pitted surface. It's not as smooth as it could be. Now it would be great if we could just take this and rub it on the sandpaper, but we can't. The depth adjuster yoke here and the lateral adjustment disc there actually stick up above the surface of the frog, and although you can get them out, it's really difficult to get them back in again, so I don't recommend it. That's why we left two edges of the sandpaper exposed on this glass. What that lets us do is work over the surface of the frog without actually having to disturb these components here. Take the frog, lay it against the sandpaper until that adjustment yoke is sitting on the edge of the glass, and then just work it back and forth a bit. Again, you can see the paper turning black from the cast iron that we're getting off. Now, after you've done the front a little bit, turn it to the side and do that. Now turn it to the other side. Now we have this whole long surface that we can use too, and we're going to need to, because you can see there's a very uneven surface here. Some parts of it are shiny, and some parts of it are still dull. It's going to need a fair bit of work to get it really flat. So now, after all that work, you can see how we have uniform shininess all over the face of the frog. There's a little bit here and here that's still kind of low, but that's so far away from the cutting edge, I really don't care about it. I'm going to clean off that dust and put the plane back together. So now I'm back at the vise. I've got my plane. It's finally 100% really ready to go. I promise, I swear, this time. And I've got a piece of test wood. I could start out with something easy like pine or even maple, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going straight to oak. And just so you know I'm for real, these are the first shavings this plane has ever taken, in my hands. I haven't done anything off camera to get it ready. Why am I going straight to oak? Well, honestly, it's been a long day, and I don't have much time left to finish shooting this video. Also, I'm just gangster. Okay, this is kind of the moment of truth. I have the plane adjusted nicely, the board's ready to go. Let's see what happens. Ah, not bad. The plane obviously needs a little bit of adjustment still. The bottom probably needs to be waxed or oiled, but these are good shavings. That again. So this is the part of the video where we talk about money. Honestly, I'm starting to feel like your dad, and it's kind of a drag. Now, this is a low-cost, hand tool series of videos, and I realize I've just completely destroyed our $100 budget with this whole bench grinder thing. But I needed to make a video about restoring planes because I had some things that were worth sharing. And if I just made the same old video that's out there, there really wouldn't have been any point. So I wanted to bring in the bench grinder and show you some things that aren't already on YouTube. Now, I do think you should own one of these if you have the money. The good news is they don't have to be expensive. Mine's a Dayton, and that's a really good brand, and yeah, I paid a fair amount of money for it. But you could go to a place like Harbor Freight and probably buy a grinder that's fine. I haven't actually tried a grinder from Harbor Freight, but for the kind of light-duty stuff that you'd be doing in your basement or your garage, it would probably last you for years. The other thing that I'd be looking for if I needed a grinder right now is an old Craftsman. They made millions of them, and you can find them at garage sales and tag sales all the time for like 20 bucks, usually with wheels or even with a wire wheel already attached. Something like that would also last you for years. So you can definitely restore your hand planes with just some basic tools, and I've linked to some videos in the description that will show you how to do that. But if you have access to a bench grinder, or if you have the means to afford one, I definitely recommend getting one and making the whole process a lot quicker. Next week, we're going to talk about sharpening, and it's going to be awesome, if you're into that sort of thing. Which you clearly are, or you wouldn't have made it to the end of this video. Thanks for watching.
One last thing before I go. I spent a little time in this video picking on James Wright, who runs the channel Wood By Wright, and I hope he doesn't take any offense, because I really like his channel. I'm subscribed, and I think you should go over and subscribe too. I watch a lot of his videos. They're entertaining and they're informative. Anyway, thanks again.